October 14, 1943, 14:37 hours. 23,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Temperature 41 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Visibility unlimited. And First Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, 23 years old, pilot of the B-17F Flying Fortress, designated 4230257 and named Deliverance by her crew, had just watched the control yoke in his hands go completely slack. He pulled back. Nothing. He pushed forward. Nothing. He turned left, then right. The yoke moved freely in both directions, offering no resistance whatsoever, connected to absolutely nothing. It was like holding a broomstick attached to empty air. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Thomas Brennan understood that he was now piloting a 65,000-pound aircraft with no means of controlling it. The cables that connected his yoke to the ailerons, elevators, and rudder, the steel tendons that allowed a pilot to command a flying fortress through the thin air of combat altitude, had been severed. Somewhere behind him, in the fuselage that was even now filling with smoke and the screams of wounded men, an 88mm flak shell had torn through the cable runs and cut every single line that mattered. Not dramatically, not immediately, but with the slow, inexorable certainty of a machine that had lost the ability to maintain controlled flight. The nose dipped forward 2 degrees, then 3, then 5. The airspeed indicator began to climb. The altimeter began to unwind. And Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, who had been a pilot for exactly 14 months and a combat pilot for exactly 17 days, who had flown precisely 4 missions over occupied Europe and had never once been hit by anything more serious than a stray machine gun round, faced a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He could order his crew to bail out over Germany, condemning them to capture, imprisonment, and possible death at the hands of civilians who had just watched American bombs fall on their factories and their homes. Or he could try to fly an uncontrollable aircraft 340 miles back to England using nothing but the 4 Wright R-1820 engines that were still somehow running, their throttles the only controls he had left. He had approximately 90 seconds to decide before the dive became unrecoverable. Brennan chose to fly. The mission that morning had been designated Mission 115 by the 8th Air Force, but the men who flew it would remember it by a different name, Black Thursday. The target was the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in the heart of Germany, beyond the range of any Allied fighter escort. The planners in England had calculated acceptable losses at 10%. They had been optimistic by a factor of 6. Deliverance had taken off from Thorpe Abbotts at 9:47 hours, the 14th aircraft in a formation of 21 B-17s from the 100th Bombardment Group. The 100th had earned a reputation as a hard-luck unit, suffering disproportionate losses in the months since their arrival in England. Some said it was bad tactics, some said it was poor formation discipline, some said it was simply the mathematics of war catching up with men who had been lucky for too long. Whatever the cause, the 100th was known throughout the 8th Air Force by a grim nickname, the Bloody Hundredth. Lieutenant Brennan had tried not to think about that nickname as he guided Deliverance into her position in the formation. He had tried not to think about the empty bunks in the officers' quarters, the men who had been there a week ago and were now listed as missing in action, killed in action, or prisoner of war. He had tried not to think about the fact that his own co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Harold Price, was flying his very first combat mission, still green enough that his hands trembled on the controls during takeoff. Instead, he had thought about the procedure, the checklist, the discipline of controlled flight that had been drilled into him at Maxwell Field and Hendricks Field and all the other training bases where young men learned to command heavy bombers. He had focused on the immediate, the technical, the things he could control. It was the only way to survive. The first fighters had appeared at 11:42 hours, just as the formation crossed the German border. Messerschmitt Bf-109s coming out of the sun in groups of 4 and 6, their wings winking with the muzzle flashes of 20mm cannons. The B-17s had closed formation, tightening the defensive box, their gunners tracking the fighters through clouds of spent brass and the acrid smell of cordite. Deliverance's ball turret gunner, Sergeant Michael Torres of San Antonio, Texas, had claimed the first kill, 109 that had pressed too close and taken a concentrated burst from his twin 50 calibers. The German fighter had rolled away trailing smoke and flame, its pilot visible as a dark shape tumbling through the empty air. But for every fighter that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The Luftwaffe had committed everything they had to the defense of Schweinfurt. Bf-109s, FW-190s, even the heavy twin-engine Bf-110s standing off at range and lobbing rockets into the bomber formations. The sky became a charnel house filled with burning aircraft, parachutes, debris, and the black flowers of flak bursts that erupted with mechanical precision as the formation passed over each German battery. By the time they reached the initial point for the bomb run, the 100th Bombardment Group had lost 6 aircraft. By the time they released their bombs over the target, they had lost 8. And somewhere in the chaos of the return flight, as the survivors tried to maintain formation discipline while the fighters circled for another pass, the flak shell that would change everything had found deliverance. Brennan had felt the impact rather than heard it. A tremendous shudder that ran through the entire airframe, followed by a lurch that threw him against his harness. The instrument panel flickered, the artificial horizon tumbled, and then the yoke went dead in his hands. "What the hell was that?" Price shouted from the co-pilot's seat, his voice high and thin over the intercom. "What happened?" Brennan didn't answer. He was already testing the controls, already discovering that he had none. The rudder pedals flopped uselessly, the yoke spun free, the trim wheels had no effect. Everything that connected the cockpit to the flight surfaces had been cut. "Crew, pilot," he said into the intercom, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Report damage, report casualties, now!" The responses came in fragments, distorted by static and fear. The radio compartment had been hit. Sergeant Williams, the radio operator, was wounded. How badly, no one could say. The waist was filling with smoke. The tail gunner, Sergeant O'Brien, wasn't responding at all, and the flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Frank Kowalczyk, had climbed down from his position in the top turret and was making his way aft to assess the damage. "Lieutenant," Kowalczyk's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with controlled panic. "You need to hear this. The whole midsection is torn up. We've got a hole you could drive a truck through. And the cables. Jesus, Lieutenant, the cables are gone. All of them. Cut clean through." Brennan closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, the nose had dropped another 3 degrees, and the airspeed had increased to 240 miles per hour. The B-17's maximum design speed in a dive was around 300. Beyond that, the airframe would begin to break apart. He had perhaps 60 seconds to figure out how to fly an aircraft that could not be flown. And then he remembered something. A throwaway comment from an instructor at Hendricks Field made during a discussion of emergency procedures. "If you lose everything," the instructor had said, "you still have your engines. You can fly a B-17 on engines alone if you're good enough and lucky enough. It's been done. Not well, but it's been done. Brennan looked at the throttle quadrant. 4 levers, one for each of the Wright 1820 radial engines that powered the B-17. Each engine produced 1,200 horsepower and was mounted on the wings, 2 on each side, an inboard and an outboard. The outboard engines were approximately 40 feet apart, which meant that by varying their power settings, he could create differential thrust. More power on the right side would push the nose left. More power on the left would push the nose right. It wasn't the same as having ailerons and rudder, but it was something. And for pitch, for the ability to raise and lower the nose, he had only one option. The engines were mounted slightly below the wing's center of pressure. If he increased power on all 4 engines, the thrust line would push the nose down. If he decreased power, the nose would come up. It was the opposite of intuitive, the opposite of everything he had been trained to do. But it might work. It had to work, because the alternative was death. Brennan pulled all 4 throttles back to idle. The effect was immediate. The nose began to rise as the airspeed bled off. The dive shallowed, then stopped, then reversed. The B-17 was climbing now, climbing too steeply, the airspeed dropping toward the stall. Brennan pushed the throttles forward again, carefully, gently, watching the instruments with absolute concentration. The nose dropped, the airspeed stabilized, and for the first time since the flak shell had hit, Deliverance was flying level.
"Oh my God," Price whispered from the co-pilot's seat. "Oh my God, it's working!"
It was working. Barely. The aircraft was wallowing like a wounded whale, oscillating in pitch and roll as Brennan fought to find the right combination of power settings. But it was flying. It was controllable. And somewhere ahead, 340 miles to the west, was England. The question was whether Deliverance could make it there before the fighters finished what the flak had started. The first Focke-Wulf found them at 14:51 hours. By then, Deliverance had fallen out of formation. There was no way to maintain position when every turn required a complex dance of throttle adjustments that took 10 seconds to execute, and was flying alone, 3,000 feet below the main bomber stream, visible and vulnerable. The FW-190 came in from the 7 o'clock position, its pilot clearly experienced, clearly aware that this particular B-17 was crippled and would make an easy kill. What the German pilot did not know was that Deliverance's guns were still working. Sergeant Torres in the ball turret saw the fighter first. He called the warning over the intercom, "Bandit, 7 o'clock low, coming in fast," and then opened fire with both 50 calibers at a range of 800 yards. The tracer stream reached out toward the Focke-Wulf, and for a moment it seemed the fighter would fly directly into the gunfire, but the German pilot was too skilled for that. He rolled away, dove, and came back around for another pass, this time from the 3 o'clock position where only the waist gunner could engage. The waist gunner was Staff Sergeant David Nowak, a 20-year-old from Chicago who had been a steel worker before the war. He tracked the incoming fighter through his ring sight, waited until the range dropped to 400 yards, and then squeezed the trigger. The 50 caliber roared, the recoil hammering against his shoulder, the spent brass cascading onto the deck plating. He saw hits, bright flashes on the fighter's engine cowling, and then the Focke-Wulf was past, rolling away to set up for another attack. "I hit him," Nowak called. "I hit him, but he's still flying." The German came back again, and again, and again, 5 passes in all, each one pressing closer than the last, each one answered by the defensive fire of Deliverance's remaining gunners. On the 4th pass, the fighter's cannon shells found the No. 3 engine, sending a spray of oil across the wing and causing the propeller to windmill uselessly. Brennan feathered the engine, shutting it down before it could catch fire, and adjusted his power settings on the remaining 3 engines to compensate for the lost thrust. On the 5th pass, Sergeant Torres got the angle he needed. The Focke-Wulf came in from directly below, climbing toward the B-17's belly, and Torres depressed his guns to maximum deflection and held the trigger down. At 200 yards, he saw pieces fly off the fighter. At 100 yards, he saw the canopy shatter. At 50 yards, he saw the pilot slump forward over his controls, and then the FW-190 rolled away and fell, spinning toward the patchwork of German farmland 20,000 feet below. There was no celebration. There was no time. Another fighter was already inbound, and then another, and Brennan was fighting just to keep the aircraft level while the gunners fought to keep the fighters at bay. They lost Sergeant Williams at 1512 hours. The radio operator, already wounded by the initial flak hit, had dragged himself back to his position and was trying to send a distress call when a Bf-109's 20mm cannon shell came through the fuselage and killed him instantly. They lost Sergeant Kowalczyk at 1534 hours. The flight engineer had gone back to try to rig some kind of manual control link using parachute cord and emergency equipment and was caught in the open during a strafing run. He died trying to fix what could not be fixed. By 1600 hours, Deliverance was flying on 2 engines. Number 3 was feathered from the earlier damage. Number 1 had been hit during the most recent attack and was streaming glycol coolant, its temperature gauge climbing toward the red line. Brennan shut it down before it could seize, and now he was flying a 65,000-pound bomber with half its normal power, no flight controls, 2 dead crew members, 3 wounded, and approximately 200 miles still to go. The fighters, mercifully, had stopped coming. They were approaching the limit of the Luftwaffe's range, approaching the invisible line where Allied fighters would take over escort duties, and the German pilots had decided that this crippled B-17 was no longer worth the fuel it would take to finish her off. They had other targets, undamaged bombers still in formation, easier kills. They let Deliverance go, but the problems were far from over. With only 2 engines running, both on the left wing, the aircraft wanted constantly to turn right. Brennan had to run the left engines at maximum continuous power while nursing every bit of thrust he could from the asymmetric configuration. The controls were still dead, the wounded were still suffering, and the English Channel was still 160 miles ahead. "Lieutenant," Price said quietly, his voice barely audible over the roar of the remaining engines, "we should talk about what happens when we get there." Brennan knew what he meant. Even if they made it back to England, even if they reached an airfield with a runway long enough to accommodate them, they still had to land. And landing a B-17 without flight controls was, by any reasonable measure, impossible. You needed elevators to control your rate of descent. You needed ailerons to keep the wings level. You needed rudder to line up with the runway. Brennan had none of these things. All he had was engines.
"We'll figure it out," he said. "One problem at a time."
Price didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. Either they would figure out how to land, or they would crash. Either way, bailing out was not an option. Not for the wounded who couldn't jump, and not for the healthy who refused to leave their brothers behind. The B-17 flew on, 2 engines screaming against the dying afternoon sky, carrying 10 men toward a landing that none of them knew how to make. They crossed the English coast at 1723 hours, just as the sun was beginning to set over the Bristol Channel. The white cliffs of Dover passed beneath them, and Brennan felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but something close to it. They had made it back. 340 miles of enemy territory, flying an aircraft that shouldn't have been able to fly, and they had made it back. Now all they had to do was get down. The Navigator, Second Lieutenant Michael Chen, had been plotting their position throughout the flight, working in the shattered nose compartment with blood from a scalp wound dripping onto his charts. He gave Brennan a heading for Manston, an RAF emergency field on the Kent coast with a runway long enough to accommodate damaged bombers. It was 30 miles ahead, 30 miles and approximately 12 minutes of flight time. 12 minutes to figure out how to land. Brennan had been thinking about the problem for the last hour, working through it methodically, trying to break the impossible into component parts that might be merely improbable. The approach would be the hardest part. He would need to descend gradually, bleeding off altitude without gaining too much airspeed, keeping the wings level using differential thrust. If he could get the aircraft lined up with the runway, pointed in the right direction, at the right altitude and the right speed, then maybe, just maybe, he could cut the power at the last moment and let the B-17 settle onto the ground. It was a terrible plan. It required precision that was nearly impossible with engine-only control. It required luck in quantities that no reasonable person could expect. And it required that nothing else go wrong in the next 12 minutes. At 17:28 hours, something else went wrong. The number 4 engine, the outboard engine on the right wing and the only thing providing any counterthrust to the 2 engines on the left, began to surge. The RPM gauge fluctuated wildly, and Brennan could hear the change in tone, a stutter, an irregularity, the sound of an engine that was not receiving a consistent fuel supply. He checked the fuel gauges. The main tanks were nearly empty. The auxiliary tanks were showing 0. Somewhere in the damage to the fuselage, the fuel lines had been compromised, and the number 4 engine was now starving. "Crossfeed," Brennan said. "Price, open the crossfeed valves. Get fuel to number 4 from the left wing tanks." Price reached for the fuel panel, found the crossfeed controls and began the procedure. But the fuel transfer was slow, too slow. The number 4 engine coughed, coughed again, and then died. The propeller began to windmill in the slipstream, adding drag to the right wing, pulling the aircraft into a descending right turn that Brennan could not correct with the remaining engines. They were now flying on one engine. One engine on the inboard left position, producing 1,200 horsepower against an aircraft that weighed 60,000 pounds and was configured for catastrophic asymmetric thrust. The B-17 began to turn right, slowly at first, then more rapidly, entering a spiral that would end in the English countryside in approximately 90 seconds if Brennan couldn't stop it. He had one option left. One thing he hadn't tried, because it was insane, because it violated every principle of aeronautical engineering, because it required trusting a mechanism that had never been designed for this purpose. The electric trim tabs. The B-17's trim system was designed to relieve control pressure during normal flight, making it easier for pilots to maintain altitude and heading without constant physical effort on the yoke. The trim tabs were small, electrically actuated surfaces on the trailing edges of the ailerons, elevators, and rudder. They were connected to their own dedicated wiring, separate from the main control cables. And if that wiring was still intact, if the flak shell had severed the cables but left the electrical system undamaged, then Brennan might be able to use the trim tabs as primary flight controls. It was a desperate hope. The trim tabs were not designed to provide the control authority needed to fly an aircraft. They were small, they were slow, they were never meant to replace the primary control surfaces. But they were all he had. Brennan reached for the electric trim switches on the center pedestal. He toggled the aileron trim to the left, feeding in a command that would raise the left aileron trim tab and lower the right one. If the system was working, the trim tabs would generate a rolling moment to counter the asymmetric thrust from the single remaining engine. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The spiral continued. The altimeter unwound. Price was saying something, shouting something, but Brennan couldn't hear him over the roar of the remaining engine and the scream of the slipstream through the damaged fuselage. And then, slowly, impossibly, the wings began to level. The electric trim was working. The dedicated wiring had survived. The tiny trim tabs, designed for nothing more than crew comfort during long flights, were now the only things keeping Deliverance from crashing into an English wheat field. Brennan let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Price," he said, his voice remarkably steady, "get on the elevator trim. I'll handle aileron and rudder. We're going to fly this thing down on trim tabs and one engine." "That's not possible," Price said. "We're about to find out." They were 4 miles from Manston, at 3,000 feet, descending at 200 feet per minute. The runway was visible through the windscreen, a long gray strip of concrete surrounded by green English fields. Fire trucks and ambulances were already lining the runway, alerted by the emergency calls that other aircraft in the formation had relayed on their behalf. Everyone on the ground knew that a crippled B-17 was inbound. No one knew exactly how crippled. Brennan began the approach. With Price managing the elevator trim to control their descent rate, he used the aileron and rudder trim tabs to keep the wings level and the nose pointed toward the runway. It was excruciatingly slow. The trim tabs responded with a lag of 3 to 4 seconds, forcing him to anticipate every correction, to think ahead rather than react. The aircraft wallowed and oscillated, never quite stable, never quite out of control. It was like steering a ship through a storm using a child's toy rudder. At 1,000 feet, they lowered the landing gear. The hydraulic system was still functioning, fed by an auxiliary pump that had somehow survived the damage, and the 3 green lights illuminated on the instrument panel. Gear down and locked. One less thing to worry about. At 500 feet, Brennan realized they were coming in too fast. The airspeed indicator showed 140 miles per hour, 20 miles per hour above the normal approach speed. He needed to slow down, but the only way to do that was to reduce power, and reducing power would cause the nose to pitch up and the aircraft to balloon, and he wasn't sure he could recover with just the trim tabs. "We're too fast," Price said. "We need to go around." "We can't go around. We don't have the fuel." The number 2 engine was already showing signs of fuel starvation, its RPM fluctuating as the last of the fuel in the left-wing tanks sloshed toward the outlet. If they tried to climb, the engine would quit and they would have nothing. This is it. One shot. 200 feet. The runway was rushing up to meet them, the concrete expanding in the windscreen, the fire trucks visible as red shapes along the edges. Brennan pulled the power back to idle, and the nose pitched up exactly as he feared. He fed in forward elevator trim, fighting the oscillation, trying to force the aircraft back toward the runway. 100 feet. Too high. Too fast, the aircraft floating in ground effect, refusing to settle. The end of the runway was approaching rapidly. If they didn't touch down in the next 3 seconds, they would run out of pavement. 50 feet. Brennan made a decision. He chopped the power completely, killing the last engine, and the B-17 fell the final 50 feet like a stone. The main gear hit first, hard enough to blow both tires and send showers of sparks cascading across the concrete. The nose gear slammed down a half-second later, and then Deliverance was sliding, not rolling, sliding on her rims and her belly, trailing smoke and fire and pieces of aluminum skin. The slide seemed to last forever. The runway disappeared beneath them, and then the grass at the end of the runway, and then a low fence that disintegrated against the nose. The aircraft finally came to rest in a field of winter wheat 400 yards beyond the runway threshold, her back broken, her engines dead, her crew alive. Alive! Brennan sat in the cockpit, his hands still on controls that no longer controlled anything, and listened to the silence. After hours of engine noise and gunfire and screaming wind, the silence was almost unbearable. Then he heard the sound of the fire trucks approaching, and the shouts of the rescue crews, and the groans of the wounded, and he remembered that they were not finished yet. He unstrapped his harness, climbed out of his seat, and went to help his crew. The final accounting was completed 3 days later. Of the 10 men who had taken off in deliverance that morning, 2 were dead: Technical Sergeant Frank Kowalczyk and Staff Sergeant Robert Williams. 3 were wounded seriously enough to be evacuated to hospitals in England: the Navigator, Lieutenant Chen, with his scalp laceration; the tail gunner, Sergeant O'Brien, who had taken shrapnel in both legs; and the waist gunner, Sergeant Nowak, who had suffered a broken arm during the crash landing. The remaining 5, including Brennan and Price, were treated for minor injuries and released. The aircraft was photographed extensively before being scrapped. Engineers from Boeing came to examine the wreckage, to study how a B-17 could be flown home with no flight controls, to understand what Brennan had done and how he had done it. Their report, filed 3 weeks later, concluded that the survival of the aircraft and crew had been the result of exceptional airmanship, intimate knowledge of aircraft systems, and a degree of good fortune that cannot be reliably replicated. In other words, it should not have been possible, but it had happened anyway. Brennan was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions that day. The citation mentioned his extraordinary courage and skill in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, his refusal to abandon his crew despite the certainty of personal danger, and his unprecedented feat of aircraft control that resulted in the safe recovery of a critically damaged bomber and 7 surviving crew members. He received the medal in a small ceremony at Thorpe Abbot's, standing in front of the other crews of the 100th Bombardment Group, trying not to think about the 2 men who should have been standing beside him. He flew again 11 days after the crash. The 8th Air Force was short on experienced pilots, shorter still on pilots who had proven they could survive the impossible, and Brennan was assigned to a new crew and a new aircraft before the bruises from the crash landing had fully healed. The new aircraft was named Deliverance II by the ground crew, a gesture of hope and continuity that Brennan neither encouraged nor discouraged. He simply flew. Over the next 7 months, he completed 23 more missions over occupied Europe. He bombed Berlin and Bremen, Augsburg and Munich, targets that had seemed impossibly dangerous before October 14th and now seemed merely routine. He lost 3 more aircraft to combat damage, though none as catastrophically as the first Deliverance. He lost 5 more crew members, their names and faces joining the long list of ghosts that followed him through the war. And he never once flew without checking, before every takeoff, that the electric trim system was fully functional. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. By then, Brennan was a captain, commanding a squadron of B-17s that had been converted for air-sea rescue duties. He had survived 56 combat missions, been shot down twice, and walked away from crashes that should have killed him 3 times. He was 25 years old. He felt ancient. He returned to the United States in July 1945. Married his high school sweetheart in August, and took a job as a test pilot for Boeing in September. The company that had built the B-17 was now developing the next generation of aircraft, jets, rockets, machines that would have seemed like science fiction when he first strapped into a flying fortress in 1942. Brennan flew them all, pushing the boundaries of what aircraft could do, applying the lessons he had learned in combat to the peacetime pursuit of aviation progress. He never talked about October 14, 1943, not to his wife, not to his children, not to the reporters who occasionally sought him out for anniversary stories about Black Thursday. When asked about his Distinguished Flying Cross, he would say only that he had been lucky, that the aircraft had been well built, that the crew had done their jobs. He never mentioned the moment when the yoke went dead in his hands. He never mentioned the 2 men who died trying to save an aircraft that could not be saved. He never mentioned the terror, the certainty of death, the desperate hope that had driven him to attempt the impossible. Some experiences could not be communicated. Some knowledge could not be shared. Some lessons could only be learned by living through them, and the living through them changed a person in ways that could never be explained to those who had not been there. Thomas Brennan died on March 3, 1998, at the age of 78. He had lived a good life, 53 years of marriage, 4 children, 11 grandchildren, a career that had contributed to some of the most significant advances in aviation history. His obituary mentioned his Distinguished Flying Cross, mentioned his service in World War II, mentioned the 56 combat missions and the remarkable survival rate. It did not mention the specific details of October 14, 1943. By then, the full story had been lost, buried in classified reports and fading memories and the silence of a man who had learned that some things were better left unsaid. But the engineers at Boeing remembered. They had studied the photographs, analyzed the damage, calculated the aerodynamic forces that should have torn the aircraft apart. They had concluded that what Brennan had done was, in the strictest technical sense, impossible, and yet he had done it anyway, flying 340 miles on engines alone, landing an uncontrollable aircraft using nothing but the trim tabs, bringing 7 men home who should have died over Germany. The report they filed in 1943 included a recommendation that would influence the design of every heavy aircraft Boeing built for the next 50 years, redundant control systems, backup cables, alternative methods of controlling the aircraft if the primary systems failed. The engineers called it the Brennan Principle, though the name never made it into official documentation. It was simply understood, within the company, that aircraft should be designed to survive the unsurvivable, because sometimes, with the right pilot, they did. At his funeral, his eldest son read a passage from a letter that Brennan had written to his wife in November 1943, 1 month after Black Thursday. The letter had been found in a box of documents in the attic, yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. It said, in part, "I have learned something in these last weeks that I do not know how to explain. It is not courage, because I am still afraid. It is not faith, because I have seen too much to believe in a benevolent God. It is something else, a knowledge, perhaps, that the worst things in life can sometimes be survived if you refuse to accept that they are the end. The aircraft was finished. The controls were gone. By every measure that mattered, we should have died. But we did not die, because we refused to die, because we kept trying to fly when flying was impossible. I do not know what this means. I only know that it is true, and that I will carry it with me for the rest of my life." The priest closed the ceremony with a blessing, and the mourners filed past the coffin to pay their last respects. Among them was an old man in a wheelchair, 91 years old, his hands gnarled with arthritis and his eyes clouded with cataracts. He had traveled from San Antonio to attend the funeral, despite the objections of his doctors and his family. He had been the ball turret gunner on Deliverance, the man who had shot down 2 German fighters while flying in an aircraft that could not be controlled, and he had come to say goodbye to the pilot who had brought him home. Sergeant Michael Torres, Mr. Torres now, long retired from the airline industry where he had spent his post-war career, placed a trembling hand on the coffin and whispered something that no one else could hear. Then he turned away, and his grandson wheeled him out of the church, and the last living member of Deliverance's crew disappeared into the afternoon sunlight. He died 4 months later, in his sleep, in the same house in San Antonio where he had grown up. His family found, among his possessions, a small piece of aluminum skin from a B-17, a fragment salvaged from the wreckage of Deliverance in the field beyond Manston Airfield, kept for 55 years in a box with his medals and his photographs. On the back of the fragment, someone had scratched 4 words with a pocket knife. "We flew it home." The B-17 Flying Fortress was not the most advanced bomber of World War II. It was not the fastest, or the highest flying, or the most heavily armed. Its defensive armament of 13 50 caliber machine guns looked formidable on paper, but was often inadequate against determined fighter attack. Its bomb load was modest compared to the British Lancaster, its range limited compared to the B-29 that would later devastate Japan. It was, in many ways, a compromise, a design that balanced competing requirements without excelling at any of them. But it had one quality that could not be measured in specifications or performance charts. It could take punishment that should have destroyed it and keep flying. It could lose engines, lose control surfaces, lose crew members, and still bring the survivors home. It was not the best bomber of the war, but it was arguably the most survivable, and in a conflict that killed 26,000 American airmen over Europe alone, survivability mattered more than any other consideration. The B-17 was retired from American military service in 1968, its role taken over by jets and missiles and technologies that would have been unimaginable to the men who flew it in 1943. But a few flying fortresses survived, preserved in museums and private collections maintained by enthusiasts who refused to let the aircraft disappear. They fly at air shows now, their Wright engines roaring against modern skies, their aluminum skin gleaming in sunlight that once illuminated fields of flak bursts and fighter contrails. People watch them pass overhead and try to imagine what it was like, the cold, the fear, the brotherhood, the desperate courage of young men flying into almost certain death. They cannot imagine it. Not really. The experience is too far removed, too alien, too terrible to comprehend from the safety of a peacetime afternoon. But they can remember that it happened, that ordinary men did extraordinary things, that aircraft that should have fallen from the sky kept flying because the crews inside them refused to give up. On October 14th of each year, a small group of historians and aviation enthusiasts gathers at the site where Deliverance came to rest, now a car park for a supermarket, the field long since paved over, and observes a moment of silence for the men who flew and the men who died. There is no plaque, no monument, no official recognition of what happened there in 1943. Just a patch of asphalt where an aircraft once slid to a stop, carrying 7 living men and the memories of 2 dead ones, at the end of a journey that should not have been possible. The last of the Deliverance crew is gone now. Torres died in 1998, the same year as Brennan. The others passed away in the years and decades before, their ranks thinning with each winter, until only the photographs and the records remained. But the story endures, passed down through families and veterans groups and the aviation community that has never forgotten what the men of the 8th Air Force accomplished and what it cost them.
When this B-17 lost all control cables, the crew still flew it home, not because they were heroes, though they were, not because they were special, though they became so, but because they were young men who did not want to die, who refused to accept the verdict that physics and probability had rendered against them, who kept working the problem until the problem was solved or they were killed in the attempt. That is not a lesson about aircraft. It is a lesson about human beings, about what we are capable of when everything else has been taken away. The B-17 was just a machine, aluminum and steel and rivets, engines and cables and guns. It flew home because the men inside it made it fly home, using ingenuity and desperation and the simple, stubborn refusal to die. They flew it home. And in the end, that was enough.